Ever caught an adult ordering a kid's meal and instantly thought, times must be tough? Back in the 50s, certain foods screamed the same thing, and today, I'm serving up the most flavorful, budget-friendly status symbols of that era. Vesta curries were actually something we got from Batchelors, which was this British company that had introduced freeze-dried instant meal kits back in the 60s. Vesta curries were the first product of that brainchild, and they were also the first product to ever hit the free market. You had shelf-stable curry meals that were available in different flavors and required almost nothing but some stovetop cooking. Meat, curry, rice, and noodles would be included, and all in all, it would make for an incredible bundle deal. Now, of course, Batchelors was something specific to the United Kingdom, but over here we had our own equivalents in the form of Swanson Television and Banquet frozen dinners. Now, as far as the beef curry went, it was pretty mild and sweet. Not really anything too standout, but enough to get the job done. The Vesta chicken curry was also pretty okay, but a lot of people just preferred the typical beef one because of the slightly chewy texture of the chicken. Vesta chow mein was a dish that had crispy noodles and a sweet and sour sauce, so it was breaking away from tradition. But all things considered, it was pretty alright too. While they were definitely adopted for British palates, the price point, as well as the fact that it was a full whole meal, made a lot of people expand their horizons in the 50s. Findus Crispy Pancakes were a Swedish frozen food company that had introduced crispy pancakes to the world, but they became a hit in America much later in the 50s and 70s. In America, the price was around 0.70 or just $1, but middle-class Americans had to choose from a fair few options. I mean, convenience culture was really popping off in this era, you know? Findus pancakes and Vesta curries had a lot to compete with and hold their own against. These pancakes were known for their airy texture, their decadent and buttery exterior, which would melt into the perfect bite as soon as you took one. Sometimes you would find yourself way too short on time. At least you wouldn't have the time to flip through your refrigerator and find out what you were going to be eating. You needed something fast, and if the deli on the corner of the street was closed, it was going to be your usual go-to from Starbucks. Most people live that way even now. But back then, you had cheap dollar-tier options like Findus pancakes, which were quick and easy enough to work with that you didn't need to worry too much about making your shift on time. The next two products we're going to take you through show you a bit of a new side of convenience food. Most of all, they show you how far it went. Bird's Eye beef burgers were the American solution to a hunger pang, and luckily enough, it worked 10 out of 10 times, all for just $1 and some cents. Bird's Eye was an incredibly massive frozen food brand, and they got that big off of their frozen beef burger format. It was a part of the wave of companies taking advantage of the state America was in after the Second World War. Not to say they were exploiting the people or anything, but hey, mouths needed to be fed and the government wasn't helping anytime soon. Thanks to all their insane rationing of beef and sources of protein, most people had gotten very accustomed to not having any ground beef to work with. When Bird's Eye came up with beef burgers in the 1970s, they basically gave people a key to incredible happiness that came in packs of 4, 6, and 12. You know how some burger joints and places come up with frozen ground beef patties, and today, you even get things like full-on premium beef patties fully frozen just ready to be grilled? That was the setup here. They were dense, dry, and they didn't have the full explosive flavor of a freshly grilled burger. But if you told someone in the 50s they could have a burger for breakfast for $1, they'd probably take you out for a drink. Rice-A-Roni was something that was introduced at the very end of the 50s by Golden Grain Macaroni, which was this company in San Francisco that became super hot across the entirety of the United States of America. Why? Same reason as the beef burgers. You get to use the easy-to-make format that convenience culture was relying on, and you get to sell it at a price point that most middle-class families were getting pretty comfortable with. The idea with price points is that when you set them, eventually people complain. They think it could be a few cents cheaper. Eventually, they get used to it, and you up it a few cents, and they complain again, and they get used to it again too. Rice-A-Ronis were combined with rice and vermicelli pastas, which gave them a really unique texture and made them even softer than what you would get from pure rice. Those extra little chewy bits of macaroni were also the perfect snack, but the thing that tied it all together was that seasoning packet, which, if you're from the 50s and you do remember, please share what you think was in that, because I will actually combust if I don't get to try out some of these vintage snacks and frozen foods that my mom never shuts up about. Some things don't get their time in the spotlight. Some things remain backup dancers, or they share it for a few seconds, but it's not really shining for them. One of those things happens to be our next item: frozen prawn cocktails. They were short-lived, and they got most of their popularity out of just being an eyebrow-raising hybrid cocktail in the 50s, back when that kind of thing was still bold and daring in the American culinary sphere. It was a notable convenience product in the 50s and 60s, but it mostly was just coasting off of the gigantic popularity that shrimp was having as a dinner party starter. This was basically a way to serve that shrimp and cater to that cravings without ever having to prepare any kind of seafood. You might be surprised, but Findus had their hands in these as well, and while shrimp cocktails were a lot more common than these ones, there were loads of bad reviews for these. Mostly, people were just complaining about how the texture and dull sauce would make itself all too apparent as soon as you defrosted or thawed it. This was, of course, going to happen since it was frozen, but it basically meant that you got this really icky drink at worst and an inconvenience paired with your steak at best, which are both things you don't want to be dealing with on your one night out on Saturday. You might really not hear this too much, but Fray Bentos were actually a Uruguayan brand that became famous first in Britain and then in America through British immigrants. The steak and kidney pie was arguably their best hit and their strongest contender for best product too. By the 1970s, Fray Bento pies were really a massive staple because they let you enjoy the delicacy that was a steak. Plus, that kidney pie went obscenely hard, like, for something that you get for $1 and bake in a can, it had no right hitting that hard. The filling on the inside was seasoned to perfection. You could tell that it was heavy, but it wasn't doing too much. The pastry, on the other hand, was the right amount of flaky and crumbly, so each bite felt super satisfying to eat, but it was also just the right kind of doughy on the inside so that when you got into chewing, you would get that soft interior. All in all, a pretty solid experience for a canned pie. Man, when I tell you tinned salmon had people addicted, you might not believe me, but really, for a time in the 50s, this was all people were eating. See, back then, fishing culture was a real thing. I mean, actual fishing culture, you know? Get a net, get your line and reel, and go to the nearest river, pond, or other undisturbed body of water and go get started. Hey, some kids even used to fish crayfish and cod out of the rivers with their hands. Salmon was actually incredibly easy to catch. It was a lot more common than you might think. Tinned salmon took advantage of the fact that it was becoming such a natural hit with the people and just really sliding into their palates comfortably. John West, Bumblebee, and Clover Leaf were all brands that were making their name in the 50s and established themselves as top-tier competitors by the later decades. You could get different kinds of salmon too, and you could even get ones with soft bones if a bit of extra calcium is what you're looking for. Of course, the rich people would only ever eat fresh salmon with a bechamel sauce or something, but working folks settled for pleasure out of a can. Do you like Cadbury chocolate? Me too. It's nice, isn't it? Well, if you came for their chocolate, you might just end up staying for their Smash Instant Mashed Potatoes, which, yes, really is by the same company. It became such a joke in the country at some point because of the non-stop advertising that was going around these. I mean, some of them even had Martian robots for some reason. Can you believe that? Not sure about their own planet, but they definitely did an amazing job at making it a staple name in most homes on ours. In the 1970s, American brands were really trying to follow the lead that Cadbury set over here. They wanted to capitalize on the fact that convenience food culture was now spreading even to things like mashed potatoes, which before, no one would have guessed. The flavor profile here was also eerily similar to what you would expect out of a typical plate of mashed potatoes. They had the same softness, the same mushiness, and brands like Pillsbury got pretty far ahead with their pre-made products. Anything that made dieting easier was something that people would rely on. Fondue, set meals were symptomatic of a larger phenomena that was enveloping all of America as the years kept coming and did not stop coming. This was basically the national full-blown craze we had with exploring other cuisines, other cultures, and other ways of preparing food. Fondue was something that came entirely out of the Book of Switzerland. Swiss culinary tradition has had fondue as a major player for years now. It was something that came to American diners during the tail end of the 50s, when fascination with European dining, sophistication in cuisine was increasing more and more. Fondue became a trend far later too, in the 70s and 80s, but it was the first time that something the rich would usually play with and have in their homes as a display was something that was not only an interest of the middle class, but also an incredibly affordable option. Now, you had fondue set meals, which were pretty pricey if I'm being completely honest with you. They were going from anywhere between $8 to $15, which if you adjusted that for inflation would run you around $80 to $150 today. I don't know what's more disappointing, that they cost that much back then or that inflation is this bad now. It was kind of worth it though, because if you did have a fondue set, everyone wanted to throw a party at your place. Plus, they made one hell of a wedding gift. You might be really used to hearing about Black Forest cakes, but they were actually known as Black Forest Gâteau and were once again something that we got from Germany. So, I'll spare you the suspense. Yes, they actually did come from somewhere a Black Forest, or at least that region in Germany is why we have them today. In the culinary world that America was in right after World War II, there was this intense need for trying out not just what the British had in store, but what Europe as a whole had to offer. I just talked about this with fondue sets, but you can really see how it was spreading to our cuisine as a whole because it was overtaking breakfast, lunch, dinner, and dessert. It wasn't an everyday dessert, but it made one amazing birthday cake. Honestly, I think it became the default option for parents who didn't have any idea on what to get their kid, but still wanted to get something that felt expensive and nice. The cake itself is a real work of art, though. You get layers of heavy, rich chocolate sponge cake, giving you the perfect cocoa-centric base, and then you get chocolate sauce and coating along with cherry brandy syrup if you're following authentic German recipes. Vol au vents directly translate to wind blown. And of course, from the translation alone, you can guess this is French, because who else would pick a dramatic name just to describe the fact that their pastries are super airy? Their roots might be French, but their usage in America was something you could only expect out of our people. These things went around like beer bottles at a frat party, and I'm so serious. They were all over cocktail parties, social calls, brunches, fancy dinners, dates, February 14th plans, like you couldn't escape it. Vol au vents themselves weren't that different from any other pastry. They were flaky, crispy, and the right kind of buttery, but it was their namesake that made them such a national hit. You couldn't find a single paste that was as light as this, and it contrasted so well with what was on the inside, which could be a mix of savory fillings or sweet dessert ones. You know, you put people through the ringer enough, they start to really miss the good, finer things in life. The post-World War era was all about that, and stuff like grapefruit starters sort of became this citrus symbol of fun that was associated with being healthy and having exotic-looking meals. Basically, it was their equivalent of food you would get for the gram. Minute Maid and Sukkist were two companies that would never stop promoting how good grapefruit was. To them, the sun shined out of these, and it could even sort your credit and fix that leaky hole in the roof if you let it stick around for long enough. Hell, they had these in cookbooks, women's magazines, all kinds of promotional material like advertisements and recipe pamphlets, and a lot more. The grapefruits themselves would be halved, then broiled with maraschino cherries and brown sugar, and then they'd be served with a little bit of rum. See, the rum and sherry were important because making your food just a little bit boozy was how middle-class America was having fun back then. Now see, sherry trifles were the perfect thing. Sometimes you need something new from another county to help shake things up, and let's be real, we're all deathly bored of cheesecakes and 3 milk cakes. We've had them too many times. Sherry trifles, on the other hand, showed the American middle class, who by this point had made European romanticization a big part of their daydreaming routine. That not only could your sponge cake be delicious, it could also be fun. It was something that was seen as really refined and also practical. Home cooks would rely on boxed mixes and other store-bought ingredients instead of going through the process of making trifles from scratch. Plus, those Betty Crocker/Duncan Hines mixes really served people well. You also had instant pudding options like Jell-O and Royal, which basically meant that making trifles in the comfort of your kitchen was super easy. The real fun came from the sherry-soaked sponge cake, though, which a lot of people thought added the perfect amount of booziness to the dish without overwhelming the taste too much. Viennetta ice cream was something that was first brought onto the scene by Unilever top dog Wall's, which is a petty, globally recognized brand at this point of history. It was something that Wall's put forward as a special occasion treat, basically the kind of thing you would want to save up for and have on a good day, kind of like how Baskin-Robbins is in some places. The flavors were really what carried this, though, and honestly, I wish I heard more of the same from some of these other items. I mean, novelty is one thing, but flavor is what keeps us all coming back, right? Luckily, Viennetta ice cream had both in space. The creamy, sweet vanilla ice cream had such a light, breezy texture, but it wasn't as velvety as your other super premium ice cream brands. The layers of chocolate were the exact opposite, thin, not thick, and quick to crackle. These were there for contrast, and I think they did an incredible job at providing it. The mild richness here was also something that really captivated people, and it was just one of the nicest comfort vanilla ice creams you could go for on a budget. Sure, they marketed it as a special occasion, but people use it more as an unwind button for when the workload from the week got far too much and the only fix was something sweet and sugary. Melon with Parma ham was something that was influenced incredibly by continental dining trends. This was something that was bubbling under the scenes thanks to America's ever-expanding admiration for all things French and our even deeper appreciation for all things Italian. The 1950s basically saw a rise in air travel, meaning that for the first time, not only were people given a chance to have a break from all the horrific things that were happening in the first half of the 50s, but they had the freedom to go and explore other countries. It was the first time people were trying things like prosciutto di Parma, otherwise known as Prima ham. This wasn't something that was widely available in American supermarkets. I mean, imports got looser decades later, but in the 50s it was rare to have this. It was also barely middle class, but it wasn't expensive enough to really call rich people food. It was definitely something that fans of Julia Child couldn't get enough of, though, especially as a starter at their dinner parties. I mean, how could they? Would she ever stop talking about it? You say the hind leg of pork that's been wet cured, and somehow that doesn't sound even a fraction as appetizing as gammon steak. It's actually incredibly close to the texture and flavor of ham, but it was a staple in American diners and supper clubs more than anywhere else. Gammon steak was known for its incredible saltiness, and it was one of the few cuts of steak to be able to pull that off without being a nuisance to your taste buds. It wasn't incredibly overwhelming, the slight smokiness covered up for it really nicely, and you paired it with pineapples and a brown sugar glaze, then you were looking at a dish that did contrast really right. Mid-tier steakhouses would often put gammon steak on the menu as an affordable, budget-friendly option for people who wanted to enjoy their time at a steakhouse but didn't necessarily have all the funds. You could get these for around $50, which was a pretty nice save compared to, let's say, $2 for a sirloin steak. Plus, by the 60s and 70s, you got pre-packaged steaks, which really only made them more of a popular meal to rely on as time went by. Pâté was something that had been a French delicacy even within French immigrant communities in America. It had been that way for a long time, and gourmet European culinary influences hadn't left this niche either. British homes in the 50s, French communities and restaurants, and Julia Child alike would all sing the praises of pâtés all day long. Melba toast, on the other hand, was a really thin and crispy toast that was made for opera singer Dame Nellie Melba, but it managed to be good enough that it became a mainstay appetizer for people who wanted to keep things low-calorie and diet-friendly. Plus, it paired so well with pâté that most people thought it was ticking both of those boxes really well. Supermarkets and brands like Underwood and Brunswick, of course, spared no time getting onto the bandwagon. Whenever something would pop off in America, it wouldn't be too long before brands began to come up with frozen, pre-made, pre-packaged, canned, or processed versions of it. Why make it at home when you can pay for it ready-made in a box near your local mom and pop, right? Plus, most people didn't exactly like working with liver, at least not in uptown cities where it was slightly less common. Scampi and chips were basically langoustine or monkfish that had been breaded and fried. This was marketed off as a classier replacement for your typical fish and chips, which meant that it was mostly targeted at British communities in America throughout the 50s. Seafood brands, especially frozen ones like Birds Eye and Young's, were behind the Scampi movement. They were the ones making it widely available in all kinds of supermarkets, with a big focus on New England, by the way. The marketing was basically focused on showing it off as this better, superior version of fish and chips in every way, and it tried to really drive home the association Scampi had with continental dining and upscale seafood joints. Even though it was sourced from ingredients that weren't really all that expensive or posh, it was definitely given the same presence, and to be fair, a lot of people bought it. Whether they did it for a trend, whether they just wanted to relax with something that was a little better than the usual fish and chips, or whether they thought delusion was really the solution, Scampi and chips was successful in replacing fish and chips for a bit. Unfortunately, it couldn't last too long because people eventually realized the difference isn't that great in taste, but it definitely is in price. Now deviled kidneys, on the other hand, were served as basically your one-stop shop for all your protein-related needs. It's something that remained popular throughout traditional steakhouses and even wealthier households in America. While it was typically a middle-class food, there was a wide range of ways to make this and mix it up. Deviled kidneys were really common in American railroad dining cars and gentlemen's clubs, and cookbooks weren't really lagging behind either. Deviled kidneys was something you wouldn't just see on menus, but all over different kinds of cookbooks like Fanny Farmer's. Steakhouses loved it, and there was still a specific brand of chef that really loved nose-to-tail cooking and butchery, and they loved these. Organ meats were something that Americans always associated rather badly with wartime rationing, though, so it's not a surprise that people didn't exactly feel like visiting these once again. Despite the fact that these are kidneys, they actually tasted wonderful. They were really rich and earthy, and kidneys tend to have a slightly metallic and an overly meaty taste, which was really something the Worcestershire sauce helped with a lot. It instead gave off an umami flavor now, which is what kept it in circulation for so many steakhouses across the 50s and the start of the early 60s. Coronation chicken was something that had strictly European origins, but the recipe eventually did find its way to really popular American food culture. Coronation chicken was something that was actually created first for Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, and it was something that was actually pretty different from your usual regal food. But hey, the next time you want to feel like you're cut from royal cloth, you can make yourself a plate of this. Gourmet caterers and high-end grocery stores definitely never got tired of doing that. In fact, they even introduced different versions of Coronation chicken towards the end of the 50s, and they instead started to pass it off as this palatable deli-style salad that you could get. This was something that definitely had its heyday in the 50s, because by the later decades, it was something that became really tired. Maybe Queen Elizabeth fell for it, but it couldn't move the American crowd too much. I mean, it just had too many things going on. It was creamy, sweet, and a little boring from all the mayonnaise and fruit that was in it. The spicy curry wasn't really anything that noticeable, and the chicken was just okay. Now, I know you've all heard more than enough about oxtail soup before. It's something that's been a big part of our culture, especially within African American communities for a long time. But did you know that it actually arrived in America through Caribbean immigrants that came through in the 19th century? Talk about history. See, offal cuts were something they were really used to using, especially Irish people and Creoles, and just about anyone who came from the Caribbean. It was something that was common in all kinds of diners, steakhouses, and it was known for being this incredibly beefy stew that had this rich broth you couldn't ever find anywhere else. After the Second World War, the government took full advantage of the fact that it was largely made from offal. They thought they finally landed on a dish that the people liked that was also cheap and affordable, but the government wouldn't predict that oxtail started to be considered a gourmet ingredient thanks to all the fans it had gained. It gradually started to increase in popularity, and by the 60s it was something that had become deeply rooted in soul food culture, which honestly all of America wanted to partake in. It was a cheap cut, but the thick stew, the warmth of the vegetables, the nice umami from the beef bones and the marrow all brought it together to make a meal that would always punch way above its weight. Sole Véronique was this classic French dish that had a poached sole as the standout feature, but this time it was with a white grape and a cream sauce. It's not something that I think most people would ever agree made headlines, but it had a presence. It was largely something that was featured in high-end restaurants, gourmet cookbooks from the 50s, and the menus of cruise liners filled with people with generational wealth. It wasn't something that ever achieved mainstream success, but it was a really elegant dish that was a fine display of continental cuisine. It was something that high-end restaurants in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago largely kept on their menus, but you might be wondering what a dish like this is even doing here. I mean, so far all you know about it is that it's French, expensive, has a selective audience, and you can find it on cruise liners. Doesn't exactly sound anywhere near middle class, does it? Flavor profile-wise, it's also something that doesn't remotely fit anything you'd find affordable or cheap. Still, even middle-class people like to go out and enjoy themselves, and when they do, whether it was a fancy date, anniversary, or something else, they'd usually spend their money on things like this. Sole was an expensive fish, you know? It wasn't like cod or haddock, and most considered it a pretty luxury ingredient. Plus, you'd also have to pay for these imported French wines, which really was half the bill on its own, honestly. Something our European neighbors gave to us again was bubble and squeak, which was something that had existed in American working-class communities for a pretty long time. Since we love our protein so much, we obviously couldn't resist the urge to throw in roast beef. Most people would mix in leftover roast beef, and it was largely something that was popular in New England and other kinds of communities. Pennsylvania and Midwest cities with big British populations, local taverns, and home chefs who had to find some way to use the beef because how would you let it go to waste? During the Depression, lots of thrift-based meals were a nice way to get rid of leftovers, which were really piling on for most people. It was something that remained popular in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles. People in these urban jungles would always be very curious about the next European trend, and this one just happened to be the most convenient of them all. Pheasant casserole was largely something you would find in rural places or upper-middle-class communities that took on hunting as a hobby. Quite the disparity, right? That's just how it is sometimes. For some people, pheasants were literally one of the best things nature could give you. And for some others, it was just a compulsion, nothing more and nothing less. This is probably why it never managed to become a mainstay in the middle-class mainstream, as chicken and beef casseroles were a lot more affordable and came with the added benefit of never needing to touch a gun. Now, pheasants were something that had been consumed in America since as far back as the early times of colonialism, but by the middle of the 20th century, it was something that had largely become exclusively synonymous with hunting culture. In the 50s, most Americans really weren't consuming any kind of pheasant. It was a rare item that was either reserved for gourmet restaurants or really special occasions, and pheasant casserole was largely just a regional specialty for people who lived near places where pheasants were abundant. The Great Plains, particularly, had a really nice population of pheasants, but over-farming was definitely something to be cautious of. Potted shrimps were something that had a massive presence in New England because, obviously, they were British. And like a moth to a flame, the shrimp would find their countrymen, pots or no pots. Luxury gourmet stores in New York also began selling them as a high-end delicacy for European customers. Places like Dean and DeLuca, if any of you still remember, were really well known for this. The shrimp were also pretty flavorful even if they did come from a superstore. People thought that this was largely because of how they were preserved in clarified butter and how this was really similar to lobster butter. It was something that helped keep the silky texture of the shrimp safe and didn't really take away from it. Still, it was a great meal to go for if you had little money to spare, and it was tasty enough that you'd forget all about the fact that it didn't come from a restaurant. Geno's pizza rolls are bite-sized turnovers filled with pizza ingredients, such as cheese, tomato sauce, and toppings. The original recipe, created by Geno Paolucci in the late 1960s, was known for its distinct flavor and crispy texture. Paulucci was inspired to create the rolls after noticing the popularity of frozen snacks, and his Italian heritage influenced the flavors. The rolls are made by wrapping a thin dough around a savory filling, then baking or frying until golden and crispy. The original recipe included a blend of cheeses, tomato sauce, and spices, creating a rich and satisfying taste. The rolls can be customized with various fillings such as pepperoni or sausage to suit different preferences. Gino's Pizza Rolls offer a quick and delicious way to enjoy pizza flavors in a portable format, making them a popular snack or party food. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Around the later half of the 20th century, there was this big public paranoia that had spread concerning health and the after effects of the way Americans had been eating. Thanks to all that rage, we got dishes like vegetable aspic cups. See, lots of Americans were coming home to an angry mom, a worried wife, or a dad who just kept saying he wouldn't pay for the doctor's fees when your eating habits would eventually circle back around to bite you. It kind of did set fear into people's hearts, especially since the arguments were so convincing. Who could deny that they were eating Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's like addicts back then, or even now? That's why there was this newfound room for fusion food or experimental recipes like vegetable aspic cups. Before, you could tell somebody about vegetables that were set in these tomato-flavored gelatins, and they'd just laugh at you. A chilled salad on top of that? But thanks to how easy convenience food culture had made things, with how you could just buy gelatin and frozen veggies whenever you needed, this was actually a really solid and healthy work lunch option. Hungry Man dinners are hearty frozen meals designed for big appetites, often featuring meats like turkey or fried chicken with sides like mashed potatoes and corn. These early versions were introduced by Swanson in 1973, aiming to provide a larger portion size than traditional TV dinners. The meals were known for their generous portions and satisfying flavors, making them popular among those with hearty appetites. The original Hungry Man dinners offered a variety of entree options, including Salisbury steak, meatloaf, and pork chops, paired with classic comfort food sides like green beans, mac and cheese, and stuffing. The meals were cooked and served in aluminum trays, allowing for easy preparation and cleanup. The substantial portions and satisfying flavors made Hungry Man dinners a go-to choice for those seeking a comforting and filling meal. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a back seat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Chicken à la king and puff pastry was another little nugget of French culture and cuisine that served us pretty well. So the idea here this time was to stuff creamy chicken and mushrooms into one single pastry, and there would be lots of these individual pastries, each stuffed to the brim. By now, we're talking about somewhere along the 70s. America's always been a big fan of cream. There's really no denying that, but I would say that we've warmed up to mushrooms a lot more than we used to. I don't think they were not popular, but they weren't exactly a standout ingredient that would be making anyone's top 10 or top 5 either. Americans were changing their palates regarding mushrooms thanks to two things, though. One, they had built up a fondness for it thanks to how many Americans, especially ones living on the edges of urban hubs, relied on foraging wild mushrooms. Two, things like cream soups, such as cream of mushroom soups, were already making the pairing of cream and mushrooms popular. This take on puff pastry wasn't exactly a long shot, since the stage was pretty much mostly set. However, I think most people have opted for things like sandwiches and ordering takeout at lunch now, or just getting a coffee. Work culture's really changed, and having a full-fledged meal during your 15-minute break isn't the most appealing option to a lot of people nowadays. Flintstones Push-Up Pops are frozen sherbet treats in a tube, featuring characters from The Flintstones on the packaging. These nostalgic treats were introduced in the 1990s by Nestlé, capturing the hearts of children with their fruity and creamy refreshment. The pops are pushed up from the bottom, offering a fun and interactive way to enjoy a cold treat. Flintstones Push-Up Pops come in a variety of fruity flavors, such as orange, grape, and cherry, and they are made with a blend of sherbet and ice cream for a smooth and refreshing texture. The sherbet mixture provides a burst of flavor, while the ice cream base offers a creamy finish, creating a delightful contrast. Flintstones Push-Up Pops were often enjoyed as an after-school snack or a summertime refreshment, making them a beloved part of many childhood memories. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side, and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Pickled beet and goat cheese sandwiches were like pretty much the same thing as a lot of the recipes from the Depression era that you see persisting beyond the 50s. There's something that people back then acquired a taste for, but this combo really brought out the best of them too. Chèvre, or as we know it, goat cheese, was something that was actually not too popular in America though. It was something that French, Spanish, and Italian immigrants popularized, but it was something that was originally first introduced in America by European settlers. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a niche thing. Not exactly the main character or a big part of the B-plot, but it was a good extra in the background, sometimes the foreground, know what I mean? Lots of small-scale farming and goat dairy farms did start to open up in places like Wisconsin, Oregon, California, and Vermont, and when the health scares started, the government only started pushing things like goat's cheese more. It wasn't a big stretch to move towards sandwiches then, and the beet and goat cheese combo was already something that worked. In today's day and age, this sandwich just isn't flashy, substantial, or tasty enough to last, though. But some people still keep it as a vegan-friendly option. Jell-O pudding pops are frozen pops made from Jell-O pudding, offering a creamy and smooth texture. These treats come in various flavors, including chocolate, vanilla, and swirl, and were a favorite among kids for their rich taste. Introduced by Jell-O in the 1970s, these pops became a popular frozen dessert option, combining the beloved flavors of Jell-O pudding with the refreshing qualities of a frozen treat. The pops are made by blending Jell-O pudding mix with milk and freezing the mixture into popsicle molds. The result is a creamy, icy pop that melts in your mouth, delivering a burst of flavor with every bite. The idea for these pops stemmed from the popularity of pudding as a comfort food, and Jell-O capitalized on this by creating a frozen version that was easy to enjoy on the go. These treats were also popular at birthday parties, where kids loved the creamy texture and delicious flavors. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches were a really straightforward dish. There wasn't a lot going on here, and it was really just a 3-ingredient dish. Finally, we're going to back sandwiches we can actually recognize and digest. Who has their stuff cold? Not me. Liverwurst and onion sandwiches luckily aren't exactly things you serve cold either. This is a dish best served piping hot. See, liverwurst in itself is just a sausage that's been made with liver and some other parts of meat. Then you take in some raw onions and sauté them, serve them between slices of toasted bread with cheese, and there you go. Liverwurst is something we got from European and German communities, and it was really popular in areas like Detroit and Pennsylvania, where there were strong populations of European communities. Liverwurst was typically always blended with warm spices like allspice and nutmeg too, so you could either make it into this flavorful pâté or slice it and layer it with other kinds of things as well as cheese, of course. It's something that just faded out of relevance, though. It wasn't bad or impractical, but I guess it was a little too simple. Kid Cuisine is a line of frozen meals for children, often featuring cartoon characters on the packaging. Introduced in 1989 by Conagra Foods, these meals provided a balanced, kid-friendly dinner with fun sides like corn or mac and cheese. The meals typically include an entree, a side, a dessert, and sometimes a small toy or game on the packaging, engaging children beyond just the meal. Kid cuisine offers a variety of options, such as chicken nuggets, mini corn dogs, and pizza, appealing to children's tastes. Kid cuisine meals are microwavable and easy to prepare, making them a convenient option for busy families. The inclusion of a dessert, such as a brownie or pudding, adds to the appeal of these meals. The variety of options also meant that there was something for every child's taste. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty. Or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. On the other hand, stuffed bell peppers were an American classic, especially in places like the South. The idea was really similar to the egg-stuffed salad tomatoes I was talking about. Even then, I told you how it's more or less like these bell peppers. The idea here this time was to hollow these peppers out and fill them in with things like rice, tomato sauce, and ground meat. They were also the perfect thing to take to work, because you could carry them in just about anything. The more transportable something was, the better it would function as a work lunch. Stuffed bell peppers also had the extra effect of giving you a boost of energy, which was always really nice because desk jobs, as I'm sure all of you might be familiar with, can suck the soul out of you. The reason these were popular in the South is because it's arguably the home of stuffed peppers and all variants of them. Those people love their spice, man. Care Bears waffles are whimsical waffles shaped like Care Bears characters, offering a fun and playful breakfast option for kids. These colorful waffles were introduced in the 1980s, becoming a popular choice for families looking to add a bit of joy to their morning routine. They were inspired by the Care Bears franchise, which was a beloved children's brand during the 1980s and 1990s. The waffles are typically made from a classic waffle batter, cooked in a waffle iron with Care Bears molds, and then served with toppings like syrup or fruit. The waffles could be customized with various toppings, such as whipped cream, chocolate chips, or sprinkles, allowing for a creative and interactive meal. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. So you might notice that this issue where you need a lot of prep work for these dishes isn't exactly a unique one. Lots of dishes share it, and even cottage cheese and pineapple bowls have the same problem. Now, this dish was something that came out around the 60s and 70s, when Americans were really into trying out new things. One of the first things they opted for was pineapple, and this was thanks to Spam, which really made the American population warm up to an otherwise chronically detested fruit. This bowl was seen as healthy, full of protein, it was cold, and it could be prepared way ahead of time. The reason this lasted as long as it did was probably because of that, though only people that were super serious about their health and diet would be bringing this kind of stuff to the office. It wouldn't make sense to ignore the perfectly convenient, cheap, and delicious deli food on the corner of your office and go for a cottage cheese and pineapple bowl. Unfortunately, while this one has the convenience factor down, it couldn't last in the long haul because tastes have just changed too much from the days where bowls like this could work. Friendly's Watermelon Roll is a unique ice cream dessert shaped like a watermelon slice, with a watermelon-flavored center, lemon-flavored rind, and chocolate chips as seeds. This refreshing treat was introduced by Friendly's in the 1980s and quickly became a favorite summer dessert. It was part of Friendly's seasonal summer menu, which featured other unique frozen treats as well. The ice cream is crafted to resemble a watermelon, with vibrant colors and realistic detailing that make it visually appealing. Friendly's Watermelon Roll is made from a combination of watermelon and lemon sherbet, creating a light and fruity flavor. The addition of chocolate chips as seeds adds a touch of sweetness and fun to the dessert, enhancing its playful appearance. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. The next thing we have on the list is salmon croquettes with creamed spinach. Now, on paper, this sounds like just what you would need, right? It's salmon, so there's protein. It's creamed spinach, so you definitely have a side that's jam-packed with nutrition. I mean, it seems ideal, the kind of thing you'd always want to be eating at work. For a long time in the 80s, that was how it worked too. People, particularly those working office and desk jobs, were very fond of this kind of lunch. It was also the perfect change in flavors from what people were originally used to. However, this was probably even more reliant on advanced preparation than egg salad stuffed tomatoes. That just wouldn't work with the way so many people were re-entering the workforce in the second half of the 20th century. It basically meant that your wife would have to stay at home and do kitchen duties every day, and most wives were opting to go to work instead. Labor-intensive meals like this, as a result, just didn't last in the long haul. Morton pot pies are frozen pot pies with flaky crusts and savory fillings, such as chicken or beef with vegetables. These classic comfort foods were introduced by Morton Frozen Foods in the 1940s, offering a hearty meal in a single dish. The pies feature a golden, buttery crust that encases a rich and flavorful filling. Morton pot pies were particularly popular for their convenience and taste, providing a meal that could be enjoyed at home or on the go. The pies were traditionally baked in the oven, allowing the crust to become crispy and golden while the filling remained hot and savory. Morton pot pies were often enjoyed as a comforting dinner or a quick lunch, offering a delicious and filling option for any time of day. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. To start it off, we're going to keep it very healthy with egg salad stuffed tomatoes. This was supposed to be a really light twist on the usual egg salad, which, as far as salads went, performed really well. Now, tomatoes aren't exactly someone's first pick when it comes to eating healthy and making your food taste good. Do they work on things like pizzas and burgers? Of course, but they're always usually a background character, even in those types of dishes. Here, though, the tomato is supposed to be the star of the show. The thing is, you're eating a tomato that's been hollowed out completely and has been stuffed with egg salad. You ever seen those jalapenos that have been emptied out and stuffed with cheese or aromatics? It's kind of like that. Why did something like this ever go out of style? Well, in today's culture of waking up half an hour before your shift because you need every bit of sleep you can possibly imagine, it just doesn't make sense to have something that's so prep work heavy as your daily lunch. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes are frozen pancakes that offer a quick and convenient breakfast option, often paired with syrup or fruit. Introduced by Aunt Jemima in the 1970s, these fluffy pancakes were a staple for busy mornings or lazy weekends. Known for their pancake mixes, Aunt Jemima expanded their line to include frozen pancakes to cater to families on the go. The pancakes are made from a classic pancake batter and then frozen to preserve their freshness. They could be heated in the microwave or toaster and were often served with toppings like butter, syrup, or fruit. Aunt Jemima frozen pancakes were particularly popular for their light and fluffy texture, as well as their convenient preparation, making them a beloved breakfast choice that offered a comforting and delicious way to start the day. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, the Klondike Choco Taco is a one-of-a-kind ice cream treat shaped like a taco. This inventive dessert features a waffle cone shell filled with vanilla ice cream and fudge. Introduced in 1984 by the Jack and Jill Ice Cream Company, the Choco Taco gained popularity for its innovative design and delicious taste. The dessert was inspired by traditional Mexican tacos, blending the concept with the classic ice cream cone. The waffle shell provides a crispy contrast to the creamy ice cream, while the chocolate coating adds a layer of sweetness. The Choco Taco was made by folding a waffle into a taco shape, filling it with ice cream and fudge, then dipping it in chocolate and sprinkling it with peanuts. The Choco Taco was a favorite at ice cream trucks and convenience stores, enjoyed by kids and adults alike. Lettuce cups and shrimp salads were pretty funny. I mean, not exactly funny, but interesting. The assembly was something you would need skill for, though, which isn't at all similar to things like peanut butter and bacon sandwiches or corned beef and cabbage wraps. Leaves had to be carefully plucked from the head of the lettuce, and these would end up forming the shape of the cups. You would then spoon the cups with fillings, which were typically things like spices, vegetables, and stir-fried ground meat, but this instance of the dish has shrimp salad instead. Why was something like this popular? Well, besides a lot of influence from Asian culture, such as Thai and Chinese wraps, they were just easy. I mean, sure, you had to get used to making a lettuce cup, but that wasn't really the hardest thing to do. What was absolutely outstanding about these was the presentation. The sheer visual appeal that this dish had wasn't something you could ever compete with, honestly. I mean, a flowery-looking cup made out of lettuce leaves? That's artistic. Plus, the vibrant and colorful fillings inside would just make it pop off even more. As far as food goes, this one was definitely a slay. Once you did get one made, then you would simply have to prepare it by heating it up. They weren't really as good for lunch at work as they were for finger foods and a pretty-looking side or appetizer at a party, though. That wraps up the list of middle-class foods that in the 70s. Comment down below which food stood out to you the most, and don't forget to like and subscribe.